l'Alliance pour le Cashew africain, en collaboration avec
Ministries of Trade and Agriculture presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. ECS conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel and Spa in Cotonou, Benin. Theme: Building capacities for a sustainable African cashew industry. Join hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses and stakeholders as we exchange knowledge, discuss pertinent industry issues, and build strategic business partnerships for a sustainable cashew industry. Grab the opportunity to participate in the 2024 ACA International Cashew Expo. Limited booths are available, and don't miss out on the field trip to the Glodibwe Industrial Zone. Register now and connect with the cashew world.
l'Alliance pour le Cashew africain, en collaboration avec l'interprofession de la filière à la carte du Bénin, sous les auspices du ministère de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Bénin et le ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Élevage et de la Pêche du Bénin, présente les 18e conférences et expositions annuelles du cashew de la carte. Saisissez l'opportunité de participer à l'exposition internationale du cashew de la carte pour 2024. Les stands sont très limités. La conférence de cette année se tiendra du 17 au 20 septembre 2024 au Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel & Spa à Cotonou, Bénin. Sous le thème « Bâtir les capacités pour une industrie du cashew africain durable », rejoignez des centaines d'acteurs de l'industrie du cashew, des entreprises et les parties prenantes pour échanger des connaissances, discuter des questions pertinentes de la filière et établir des partenariats commerciaux stratégiques pour une industrie du cashew durable. Participez également à la visite de la zone industrielle de Glodibwe. Inscrivez-vous dès maintenant et entrez en contact avec le monde de l'anacarde.
The African Cashew Alliance, ACA, in collaboration with Benin's Cashew Interprofession, IFA Benin, and Ministries of Trade and Agriculture, presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. ECS conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel and Spa in Cotonou, Benin. Theme: Building capacities for a sustainable African cashew industry. Join hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses and stakeholders as we exchange knowledge, discuss pertinent industry issues, and build strategic business partnerships for a sustainable cashew industry. Grab the opportunity to participate in the 2024 ACA International Cashew Expo. Limited booths are available, and don't miss out on the field trip to the Glodibwe Industrial Zone. Register now and connect with the cashew world.
L'Alliance pour le Cashew africain, en collaboration avec l'interprofession de la filière à la carte du Bénin, sous les auspices du ministère de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Bénin et le ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Élevage et de la Pêche du Bénin, présente les 18e conférences et expositions annuelles du cashew de la carte. Saisissez l'opportunité de participer à l'exposition internationale du cashew de la carte pour 2024. Les stands sont très limités. La conférence de cette année se tiendra du 17 au 20 septembre 2024 au Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel & Spa à Cotonou, Bénin. Sous le thème « Bâtir les capacités pour une industrie du cashew africain durable », rejoignez des centaines d'acteurs de l'industrie du cashew, des entreprises et les parties prenantes pour échanger des connaissances, discuter des questions pertinentes de la filière et établir des partenariats commerciaux stratégiques pour une industrie du cashew durable. Participez également à la visite de la zone industrielle de Glodibwe. Inscrivez-vous dès maintenant et entrez en contact avec le monde de l'anacarde.
The African Cashew Alliance, ACA, in collaboration with Benin's Cashew Interprofession, IFA Benin, and Ministries of Trade and Agriculture, presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. ECS conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel and Spa in Cotonou, Benin. Theme: Building capacities capacities for a sustainable African cashew industry. Join hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses and stakeholders as we exchange knowledge, discuss pertinent industry issues, and build strategic business partnerships for a sustainable cashew industry. Grab the opportunity to participate in the 2024 ACA International Cashew Expo. Limited booths available, and don't miss out on the field trip to the Glodibwe Industrial Zone. Register now and connect with the Cashew Alliance.
L'Alliance pour le Cashew africain, en collaboration avec l'interprofession de la filière à la gare du Bénin, sous les auspices du ministère de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Bénin et du ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Élevage et de la Pêche du Bénin, présente la 18e conférence et exposition annuelle du cashew de la CAP. Saisissez l'opportunité de participer à l'exposition internationale du cashew de la CAP pour 2024. Les stands sont très limités. La conférence de cette année se tiendra du 17 au 20 septembre 2024 au Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel & Spa à Cotonou, Bénin. Sous le thème « Bâtir les capacités pour une industrie du cashew africain durable », vous rejoignez des centaines d'acteurs de l'industrie du cashew, des entreprises et les parties prenantes pour échanger des connaissances, discuter des questions pertinentes de la filière et établir des partenariats commerciaux stratégiques pour une industrie du cashew durable. Participez également à la visite de la zone industrielle de Glodibwe. Inscrivez-vous dès maintenant et entrez en contact avec le monde de la NACAR.
The African Cashew Alliance (ACA), in collaboration with Benin's Cashew Interprofession (IFA Benin) and Ministries of Trade and Agriculture, presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. This year's conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel and Spa in Cotonou, Benin. Theme: Building capacities for a sustainable African cashew industry. Join hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses and stakeholders as we exchange knowledge, discuss pertinent industry issues, and build strategic business partnerships for a sustainable cashew industry. Grab the opportunity to participate in the 2024 ACA International Cashew Expo. Limited booths available, and don't miss out on the field trip to the Glodibwe Industrial Zone. Register now and connect with the Cashew Alliance.
L'Alliance pour le cashew africain, en collaboration avec l'interprofession de la filière à la gare du Bénin, sous les auspices du ministère de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Bénin et du ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Élevage et de la Pêche du Bénin, présente la 18e conférence et exposition annuelle du cashew de la CAP. Saisissez l'opportunité de participer à l'exposition internationale du cashew de la CAP pour 2024. Les stands sont très limités. La conférence de cette année se tiendra du 17 au 20 septembre 2024 au Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel & Spa à Cotonou, Bénin. Sous le thème « Bâtir les capacités pour une industrie du cashew africain durable », vous rejoignez des centaines d'acteurs de l'industrie du cashew, des entreprises et les parties prenantes pour échanger des connaissances, discuter des questions pertinentes de la filière et établir des partenariats commerciaux stratégiques pour une industrie du cashew durable. Participez également à la visite de la zone industrielle de Glodibwe. Inscrivez-vous dès maintenant et entrez en contact avec le monde de la NACAR.
The African Cashew Alliance (ACA), in collaboration presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. This year's conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel and Spa in Cotonou, Benin. Theme: Building capacities for a sustainable African cashew industry. Join hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses and stakeholders as we exchange knowledge, discuss pertinent industry issues, and build strategic business partnerships for the sustainable cashew industry. Grab the opportunity to participate in the 2024 ACA International Cashew Expo. Limited booths available, and don't miss out on the field trip to the Glodibwe Industrial Zone. Register now and connect with the Cashew world.
L'Alliance pour le Cashew africain, en collaboration avec l'interprofession de filière à la carte du Bénin, sous les auspices du ministère de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Bénin et le ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Élevage et de la Pêche du Bénin, présente les 18e conférences et expositions annuelles du Cashew de la carte. Saisissez l'opportunité de participer à l'exposition internationale du Cashew de la carte pour 2024. Les stands sont illimités. La conférence de cette année se tiendra du 17 au 20 septembre. Sofitel Coton. Rejoignez les centres pour une industrie du cajou à la vie dès maintenant et entrez en contact avec le monde de la carte.
The African Cashew Alliance, ACA, in collaboration with Benin's Cashew Interprofession, IFA Benin, and Ministries of Trade and Agriculture, presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. This year's conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel and Spa in Cotonou, Benin. Theme: Building capacities for a sustainable African cashew industry. Join hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses and stakeholders as we exchange knowledge, discuss pertinent industry issues, and build strategic business partnerships for the sustainable cashew industry. Grab the opportunity to participate in the 2024 ACA International Cashew Expo. Limited booths available, and don't miss out on the field trip to the Glodibwe Industrial Zone. Register now and connect with the Cashew world.
L'Alliance pour le Cashew africain, en collaboration avec l'interprofession de filière à la carte du Bénin, sous les auspices du ministère de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Bénin et le ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Élevage et de la Pêche du Bénin, présente les 18e conférences et expositions annuelles du Cashew de la carte. Saisissez l'opportunité de participer à l'exposition internationale du Cashew de la carte pour 2024. Les stands sont illimités. La conférence de cette année se tiendra du 17 au 20 septembre 2024 au Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel et Spa à Cotonou, Bénin. Sous le thème Bâtir les capacités pour une industrie du cajou africain durable, rejoignez des centaines d'acteurs de l'industrie du cajou, des entreprises et les parties prenantes pour échanger des connaissances, discuter des questions pertinentes de la filière et établir des partenariats commerciaux stratégiques pour une industrie du cajou durable. Participez également à la visite de la zone industrielle de Glodibwe. Inscrivez-vous dès maintenant et entrez en contact avec le monde de la carte.
The African Cashew Alliance, ACA, in collaboration with Benin's Cashew Interprofession, IFA Benin, and Ministries of Trade and Agriculture, presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. This year's conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel and Spa in Cotonou, Benin. Theme: Building capacities for a sustainable African cashew industry. Join hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses and stakeholders as we exchange knowledge, discuss pertinent industry issues, and build strategic business partnerships for the sustainable cashew industry. Grab the opportunity to participate in the 2024 ACA International Cashew Expo. Limited booths available, and don't miss out on the field trip to the Glodibwe Industrial Zone. Register now and connect with the Cashew world.
L'Alliance pour le Cashew africain, en collaboration avec l'interprofession de filière à la gare du Bénin, sous les auspices du ministère de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Bénin et du ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Élevage et de la Pêche du Bénin, présente les 18e conférences et expositions annuelles du Cashew de la CAC. Saisissez l'opportunité de participer à l'exposition internationale du Cashew de la CAC pour 2024. Les stands sont très limités. La conférence de cette année se tiendra du 17 au 20 septembre 2024 au Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel & Spa à Cotonou, Bénin. Sous le thème « Bâtir les capacités pour une industrie du cajou africain durable », rejoignez des centaines d'acteurs de l'industrie du cajou, des entreprises et les parties prenantes pour échanger des connaissances, discuter des questions pertinentes de la filière et établir des partenariats commerciaux stratégiques pour une industrie du cajou durable. Participez également à la visite de la zone industrielle de Glodibwe. Inscrivez-vous dès maintenant et entrez en contact avec le monde de la NACAR.
The African Cashew Alliance, ACA, in collaboration with Benin's Cashew Interprofession, IFA Benin, and Ministries of Trade and Agriculture, presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference in SP. ECS conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel & Spa in Cotonou, Benin. Team: Building capacities for a sustainable African cashew industry. Join hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses and stakeholders as we exchange knowledge, discuss pertinent industry issues, and build strategic business partnerships for a sustainable cashew industry. Grab the opportunity to participate in the 2024 ACA International Cashew Expo. Limited booths available, and don't miss out on the field trip to the Glodibwe Industrial Zone. Register now and connect with the Cashew world.
L'Alliance pour le Cashew africain, en collaboration avec l'interprofession de filière à la gare du Bénin, sous les auspices du ministère de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Bénin et le ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Élevage et de la Pêche du Bénin, présente les 18e conférences et expositions annuelles du Cashew de la CAC. Saisissez l'opportunité de participer à l'exposition internationale du Cashew de la CAC pour 2024. Les stands sont très limités. La conférence de cette année se tiendra du 17 au 20 septembre 2024 au Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel & Spa à Cotonou, Bénin. Sous le thème « Bâtir les capacités pour une industrie du cajou africain durable », rejoignez des centaines d'acteurs de l'industrie du cajou, des entreprises et les parties prenantes pour échanger des connaissances, discuter des questions pertinentes de la filière et établir des partenariats commerciaux stratégiques pour une industrie du cajou durable. Participez également à la visite de la zone industrielle de Glodibwe. Inscrivez-vous dès maintenant et entrez en contact avec le monde de la NACAR.
The African Cashew Alliance, ACA, in collaboration with Benin's Cashew Interprofession, IFA Benin, and Ministries of Trade and Agriculture, presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference in SP. ECS conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel & Spa in Cotonou, Benin. Team: Building capacities for a sustainable African cashew industry. Join hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses and stakeholders as we exchange knowledge, discuss pertinent industry issues, and build strategic business partnerships for a sustainable cashew industry. Grab the opportunity to participate in the 2024 ACA International Cashew Expo. Limited booths available, and don't miss out on the field trip to the Glodibwe Industrial Zone. Register now and connect with the Cashew world.
l'Alliance pour le cajou africain, en collaboration avec l'interprofession de la filière à la carte du Bénin, sous les auspices du ministère de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Bénin et le ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Élevage et de la Pêche du Bénin, présente la 18e conférence et exposition annuelle du cajou de Dakar. Saisissez l'opportunité de participer à l'exposition internationale du cajou de Dakar pour 2024. Les stands sont très limités. La conférence de cette année se tiendra du 17 au 20 septembre 2024 au Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel & Spa à Cotonou, Bénin. Sous le thème « Bâtir les capacités pour une industrie du cajou africain durable », vous rejoignez des centaines d'acteurs de l'industrie du cajou, des entreprises et les parties prenantes pour échanger des connaissances, discuter des questions pertinentes de la filière et établir des partenariats commerciaux stratégiques pour une industrie du cajou durable. Participez également à la visite de la zone industrielle de Glodjibé. Inscrivez-vous dès maintenant et entrez en contact avec le monde de la NACAR.
The African Cashew Alliance, ACA, in collaboration with Benin's Cashew Interprofession, IFA Benin, and Ministries of Trade and Agriculture, presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference in Espoo. ECS conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel & Spa in Cotonou, Benin. Theme: Building Capacities for a Sustainable African Cashew Industry. Join hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses and stakeholders as we exchange knowledge, discuss pertinent industry issues, and build strategic business partnerships for a sustainable cashew industry. Grab the opportunity to participate in the 2024 ACA International Cashew Expo. Limited booths available, and don't miss out on the field trip to the Glodjibé Industrial Zone. Register now and connect with the cashew world.
L'Alliance pour le cajou africain, en collaboration avec l'interprofession de la filière à la carte du Bénin, sous les auspices du ministère de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Bénin et le ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Élevage et de la Pêche du Bénin, présente la 18e conférence et exposition annuelle du cajou de Dakar. Saisissez l'opportunité de participer à l'exposition internationale du cajou de Dakar pour 2024. Les stands sont très limités. La conférence de cette année se tiendra du 17 au 20 septembre 2024 au Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel & Spa à Cotonou, Bénin. Sous le thème « Bâtir les capacités pour une industrie du cajou africain durable », vous rejoignez des centaines d'acteurs de l'industrie du cajou, des entreprises et les parties prenantes pour échanger des connaissances, discuter des questions pertinentes de la filière et établir des partenariats commerciaux stratégiques pour une industrie du cajou durable. Participez également à la visite de la zone industrielle de Glodjibé. En contact avec le monde de la NACAR.
The African Cashew Alliance, ACA, in collaboration with Benin's Cashew Interprofession, IFA Benin, and Ministries of Trade and Agriculture, presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference in Espoo. ECS conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel & Spa in Cotonou, Benin. Theme: Building Capacities for a Sustainable African Cashew Industry. Join hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses and stakeholders as we exchange knowledge, discuss pertinent industry issues, and build strategic business partnerships for a sustainable cashew industry. Grab the opportunity to participate in the 2024 ACA International Cashew Expo. Limited booths available, and don't miss out on the field trip to the Glodjibé Industrial Zone. Register now and connect with the cashew world.
L'Alliance pour le cajou africain, en collaboration avec l'interprofession de la filière à la carte du Bénin, sous les auspices du ministère de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Bénin et le ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Élevage et de la Pêche du Bénin, présente la 18e conférence et exposition annuelle du cajou de Dakar. Saisissez l'opportunité au Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel & Spa à Cotonou, au Bénin. Sous le thème « Bâtir les capacités pour une industrie du cajou africain durable », vous rejoignez des centaines d'acteurs de l'industrie du cajou, des entreprises et les parties prenantes pour échanger des connaissances, discuter des questions pertinentes de la filière et établir des partenariats commerciaux stratégiques pour une industrie du cajou durable. Participez également à la visite de la zone industrielle de Glodjibé. Inscrivez-vous dès maintenant et entrez en contact avec le monde de l'anacarde.
The African Cashew Alliance, ACA, in collaboration with Benin's Cashew Interprofession, IFA Benin, and Ministries of Trade and Agriculture, presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference. ECS conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel and Spa in Cotonou, Benin. Team: Building capacities for a sustainable African cashew industry. Join hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses and stakeholders as we exchange knowledge, discuss pertinent industry issues, and build strategic business partnerships for a sustainable cashew industry. Grab the opportunity to participate in the 2024 ACA International Cashew Expo. Limited booths available, and don't miss out on the field trip to the Glodjibé Industrial Zone. Register now and connect with the cashew world.
L'Alliance pour le cajou africain, en collaboration avec l'interprofession de la filière anacarde du Bénin, sous les auspices du ministère de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Bénin et le ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Élevage et de la Pêche du Bénin, présente la 18e conférence et exposition annuelle du cajou de l'Aka. Saisissez l'opportunité de participer à l'exposition internationale du cajou de l'Aka pour 2024. Les stands sont très limités. La conférence de cette année se tiendra du 17 au 20 septembre 2024 au Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel et Spa à Cotonou, au Bénin. Sous le thème « Bâtir les capacités pour une industrie du cajou africain durable », vous rejoignez des centaines d'acteurs de l'industrie du cajou, des entreprises et les parties prenantes pour échanger des connaissances, discuter des questions pertinentes de la filière et établir des partenariats commerciaux stratégiques pour une industrie du cajou durable. Participez également à la visite de la zone industrielle de Glodjibé. Inscrivez-vous dès maintenant et entrez en contact avec le monde de l'anacarde.
The African Cashew Alliance, ACA, in collaboration with Benin's Cashew Interprofession, IFA Benin, and Ministries of Trade and Agriculture, presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. ECS conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel and Spa in Cotonou, Benin. Team: Building capacities for a sustainable African cashew industry. Join hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses and stakeholders as we exchange knowledge, discuss pertinent industry issues, and build strategic business partnerships for a sustainable cashew industry. Grab the opportunity to participate in the 2024 ACA International Cashew Expo. Limited booths available, and don't miss out on the field trip to the Glodjibé Industrial Zone. Register now and connect with the cashew world.
L'Alliance pour le cajou africain, en collaboration avec l'interprofession de la filière anacarde du Bénin, sous les auspices du ministère de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Bénin et le ministère de l'Agriculture et Pêche du Bénin, présente la 18e conférence et exposition annuelle du cajou de l'Aka. Saisissez l'opportunité de participer à l'exposition internationale du cajou de l'Aka pour 2024. Les stands sont très limités. La conférence de cette année se tiendra du 17 au 20 septembre 2024 au Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel et Spa à Cotonou, au Bénin. Sous le thème « Bâtir les capacités pour une industrie du cajou africain durable », vous rejoignez des centaines d'acteurs de l'industrie du cajou, des entreprises et les parties prenantes pour échanger des connaissances, discuter des questions pertinentes de la filière et établir des partenariats commerciaux stratégiques pour une industrie du cajou durable. Participez également à la visite de la zone industrielle de Glodjibé. Inscrivez-vous dès maintenant et entrez en contact avec le monde de l'anacarde.
The African Cashew Alliance, ACA, in collaboration with Benin's Cashew Interprofession, IFA Benin, and Ministries of Trade and Agriculture, presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. This year's conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel and Spa in Cotonou, Benin. Theme: Building capacities for a sustainable African cashew industry. Join hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses and stakeholders as we exchange knowledge, discuss pertinent industry issues, and build strategic business partnerships for a sustainable cashew industry. Grab the opportunity to participate in the 2024 ACA International Cashew Expo. Limited booths available, and don't miss out on the field trip to the Glodjibé Industrial Zone. Register now and connect with the cashew world.
L'Alliance pour le cajou africain, en collaboration avec l'interprofession de la filière anacarde du Bénin, sous les auspices du ministère de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Bénin et le ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Élevage et de la Pêche du Bénin, présente les 18e conférences et expositions annuelles du cajou de la CAP. Saisissez l'opportunité de participer à l'exposition internationale du cajou de la CAP pour 2024. Les stands sont très limités. La conférence de cette année se tiendra du 17 au 20 septembre 2024 au Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel & Spa à Cotonou, Bénin. Sous le thème « Bâtir les capacités pour une industrie du cajou africain durable », rejoignez des centaines d'acteurs de l'industrie du cajou, des entreprises et les parties prenantes pour échanger des connaissances, discuter des questions pertinentes de la filière et établir des partenariats commerciaux stratégiques pour une industrie du cajou durable. Participez également à la visite de la zone industrielle de Glodjibé. Inscrivez-vous dès maintenant et entrez en contact avec le monde de l'anacarde.
The African Cashew Alliance, ACA, in collaboration with Benin's Cashew Interprofession, IFA Benin, and Ministries of Trade and Agriculture, presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. This year's conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel and Spa in Cotonou, Benin. Theme: Building capacities for a sustainable African cashew industry. Join hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses and stakeholders as we exchange knowledge, discuss pertinent industry issues, and build strategic business partnerships for a sustainable cashew industry. Grab the opportunity to participate in the 2024 ACA International Cashew Expo. Limited booths available, and don't miss out on the field trip to the Glodjibé Industrial Zone. Register now and connect with the cashew world.
L'Alliance pour le cajou africain, en collaboration avec l'interprofession de la filière anacarde du Bénin, sous les auspices du ministère de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Bénin et le ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Élevage et de la Pêche du Bénin, présente les 18e conférences et expositions annuelles du cajou de la CAP. Saisissez l'opportunité de participer à l'exposition internationale du cajou de la CAP pour 2024. Les stands sont très limités. La conférence de cette année se tiendra du 17 au 20 septembre 2024 au Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel & Spa à Cotonou, Bénin. Sous le thème « Bâtir les capacités pour une industrie du cajou africain durable », rejoignez des centaines d'acteurs de l'industrie du cajou, des entreprises et les parties prenantes pour échanger des connaissances, discuter des questions pertinentes de la filière et établir des partenariats commerciaux stratégiques pour une industrie du cajou durable. Participez également à la visite de la zone industrielle de Glodjibé. Inscrivez-vous dès maintenant et entrez en contact avec le monde de l'anacarde.
The African Cashew Alliance (ACA), in collaboration with Benin's Cashew Interprofession (IFA Benin) and Ministries of Trade and Agriculture, presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference in Espoo. This year's conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel and Spa in Cotonou, Benin. Theme: Building capacities for a sustainable African cashew industry. Join hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses and stakeholders as we exchange knowledge, discuss pertinent industry issues, and build strategic business partnerships for a sustainable cashew industry. Grab the opportunity to participate in the 2024 ACA International Cashew Expo. Limited booths available, and don't miss out on the field trip to the Glodibwe Industrial Zone. Register now and connect with the cashew world.
L'Alliance pour le cashew africain, en collaboration avec l'interprofession de la filière à la gare du Bénin, sous les auspices du ministère de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Bénin et le ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Élevage et de la Pêche du Bénin, présente la 18e conférence et exposition annuelle du cashew de la gare. Saisissez l'opportunité de participer à l'exposition internationale du cashew de la gare pour 2024. Les stands sont très limités. La conférence de cette année se tiendra du 17 au 20 septembre 2024 au Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel & Spa à Cotonou, Bénin. Sous le thème « Bâtir les capacités pour une industrie du cashew africain durable », rejoignez des centaines d'acteurs de l'industrie du cashew, des entreprises et les parties prenantes pour échanger des connaissances, discuter des questions pertinentes de la filière et établir des partenariats commerciaux stratégiques pour une industrie du cashew durable. Participez également à la visite de la zone industrielle de Glodibwe. Inscrivez-vous dès maintenant et entrez en contact avec le monde de la NACARS.
The African Cashew Alliance (ACA), in collaboration with Benin's Cashew Interprofession (IFA Benin) and Ministries of Trade and Agriculture, presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference in Espoo. This year's conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel and Spa in Cotonou, Benin. Theme: Building capacities for a sustainable African cashew industry. Join hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses and stakeholders as we exchange knowledge, discuss pertinent industry issues, and build strategic business partnerships for a sustainable cashew industry. Grab the opportunity to participate in the 2024 ACA International Cashew Expo. Limited booths available, and don't miss out on the field trip to the Glodibwe Industrial Zone. Register now and connect with the cashew world.
L'Alliance pour le cashew africain, en collaboration avec l'interprofession de la filière à la gare du Bénin, sous les auspices du ministère de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Bénin et le ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Élevage et de la Pêche du Bénin, présente la 18e conférence et exposition annuelle du cashew de la gare. Saisissez l'opportunité de participer à l'exposition internationale du cashew de la gare pour 2024. Les stands sont très limités. La conférence de cette année se tiendra du 17 au 20 septembre 2024 au Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel & Spa à Cotonou, Bénin. Sous le thème « Bâtir les capacités pour une industrie du cashew africain durable », rejoignez des centaines d'acteurs de l'industrie du cashew, des entreprises et les parties prenantes pour échanger des connaissances, discuter des questions pertinentes de la filière et établir des partenariats commerciaux stratégiques pour une industrie du cashew durable. Participez également à la visite de la zone industrielle de Glodibwe. Inscrivez-vous dès maintenant et entrez en contact avec le monde de la NACARS.
The African Cashew Alliance (ACA), in collaboration with Benin's Cashew Interprofession (IFA Benin) and Ministries of Trade and Agriculture, presents the 18th ACA Annual Cashew Conference in Espoo. This year's conference will be held from the 17th to the 20th September 2024 at the Sofitel Cotonou Marina Hotel and Spa in hundreds of cashew industry players, businesses, and stakeholders. Sustainable cashew industry.
Hi, Stella, your mic is off. Hello, Stella, your mic is off. Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. I think our host, my co-host, Stella, is experiencing some challenges, but then you're welcome. I see Jim is ready.
Hello, from wherever you are, and thank you for joining the
Hand over
Global
to her
Market.
then. Okay, so Jim Fitzpatrick, I know that you are ready and with all the right information for us for this edition. Before I hand over to you, however, I have to mention that the conference is all set. Remember, it's taking place from the 17th to 20th of September this year in Cotonou. The 20th is mainly for the field visit to the Arise Glojigbe Industrial Zone, where you will see the policy of the Benin government in action. We are expecting a number of speakers. I know Jim Fitzpatrick, you are part, and many more from around the world to help us explore the theme for this year. Let me also say that this is made possible with the kind support of the European Union, and OACPS, GIZ, USAID, the Cashew Club, also Sustainable Nuts Initiative. Let me mention that when we resume, this is going to be the last edition of the GME, but when we resume in October, we will also be having a second webinar, and this webinar will focus mainly on sustainability issues as this one is looking at the markets. So without much talk, I'll hand over to you, Jim Fitzpatrick. Hi, Jim, how are you?
Oh, good, Ernest. How are you doing?
Andre,
Yes,
you
I'm
people
fine.
blocked me.
And I hope that you are ready for us.
Always, Ernest. Always ready to talk
Thank you
cashews.
so much, and please, the floor is yours. The participants and listeners are waiting, yes.
Do me one favor, Ernest. Can you confirm that my screen is properly shared?
Yes, I can see your screen properly.
Great.
With the ACA Cashew iForums 2024 GME Encounter number 71. So you are good to go, Jim.
Can you believe it?
Very good.
Hello, everyone. You're very welcome. It's good to be with you. It's a strange time of year in the cashew business, isn't it? The end of August. It's a time of year when usually there's not much going on, but this year everything is running a bit late. So I just thought we'd start off by trying to fix ourselves in the calendar in time and have a look at what we might expect August to December normally, and this year what's different. And then we'll have a look at some production, and we'll start our look at Southern Hemisphere production. Interesting time of year in that sense too. We'll have a look at really what is the fulcrum for the rest of the year, and particularly for the outcome on pricing, and that is the balances and needs of RCN in Vietnam and of course in India. And we'll finish off with a look at demand, and we'll have a look at trade and see where that leaves us. And let's try and draw some conclusions where this market might go, and also now coming on the horizon where it might be in February and March at the start of the Northern Hemisphere crop 2025. It's really not that far away now. So let's start off and talk about this time of year, August to December. We'll start off in the typical way we'll do. We'll have a look at production, we'll have a look at demand, we'll have a look at pricing. We'll see if we can draw any conclusions. So starting with production, this time of year is the lowest period of the year for cashew production. As you can see in this monthly harvest in shell chart, you can see that we have production peaking in the first, second quarters, and then it slumps during August and September with a little bit of a bump at the end of the year as those Southern Hemisphere crops come into play. So this is a low period for the harvest. This year, we've had lower crops in India, in Vietnam, and in West Africa, lower than expected, although a higher crop in Cambodia. And of course, also we've had lower quality raw cashew nuts in West Africa, partly due to the weather, but that's been accentuated by a number of other factors too. Of course, all this product doesn't come to market immediately. It takes time because most of it has to be shipped. And the actual availability in a normal situation looks a little bit like this. So the red bars would be the availability as it comes to market for processing. So if you look at the red bars and compare them to the production over here, you'll see that that is pushed a little bit later. And of course, this year, it's pushed a little bit later again for a variety of reasons. Firstly, because the crops in West Africa came late. That later crop has had a profound impact on the season so far, but it's also been impacted by disruption to freight, longer journey times. Sometimes containers seem to disappear for weeks on end. And of course, we had the final factor, the Ivorian export ban. And what's that done has pushed availability of a lot of the RCN forward from July and August into September and probably into October. So this year, we're in a different situation to that we normally expect. And that's for these factors. So material is coming later to the market. Let's have a look at that on the demand and consumption side for August, December. So typically August through to December, January is a festival period in China, of course in India, and also in Western countries in North America, Thanksgiving and Christmas, in Europe, Christmas, New Year, and eventually that festival season ends, from a cashew point of view anyway, with Chinese New Year. So it's a peak consumption period in many countries, but that doesn't mean that it's a peak trading period, that it's a peak import period. So I thought let's have a look at some of these markets and have a think about what this means. Peak demand period, peak consumption period, but not necessarily peak buying period. So if we look in Europe, so you have monthly cashew kernel imports into the European market. You can see as we go through, this is through 2023, we can see it tends to peak mid-year, July, August, September. And that product will then be processed, probably roasted, packed, and delivered out to consumers, a lot of it in the last quarter of the year. European buyers buy forward, imports peak in the middle of the year. So we shouldn't expect a lot of European demand in the last quarter of the year. Europe nowadays accounts for about 20% of world demand. The US, about 19% of world demand, similar situation. Imports tend to peak slightly earlier in the US, but also American buyers buy forward And imports tend to be at the lowest level of the year at the end of the fourth quarter and the beginning of the first quarter. So in terms of buying for delivery in this period, either in the US or in the European market, we shouldn't expect too much. If people are buying, they're likely to be buying forward, and they're likely to be perhaps covering in containers for additional demand. Now, that might be different this year because there's been a lot of contract disruption, a lot of default. A lot of people are being forced to buy contracts they don't need and they don't want, simply because they need to do that either to get delivery of their existing lower priced contracts, or because they're just not getting those lower priced contracts and they need to replace them. So this can give a slightly false aspect to the market, and that can have a big impact on how people see the market going forward and the forward buying that they do. More about that a little bit later. Looking at China, increasingly an important market, about 10% of world consumption nowadays. Not much forward buying in China. The peak demand for Chinese New Year is later than these festivals in India or in Western countries. So Chinese imports actually peak toward the end of the year. Now that would change the nature of the market in times to come as Chinese consumption grows, but for now at about 10%, it's not having a dynamic impact on how the market behaves in the last quarter. But watch out, that is going to change in years to come. Let's have a look at the biggest consumer. So India, from our perspective in the international market, we see Indian demand primarily in the form of demand for raw cashew nuts. And in India, we can see that the imports tend to peak, at least in the past, mid-year, July, August time. A little bit lower this year. You can see the red bars, the monthly imports up to July. July was a good month, but prior to that, we see slightly lower performance. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later too. What we are seeing in India so far is fairly steady growth demand, not the kind of dramatic demand that we saw 10 years ago, 6, 7 years ago even, but lower level demand, still healthy, still growing steadily. And at the moment, quite healthy, but again, a question mark about the impact of higher cashew kernels prices on Indian consumers. Personally, I don't think it's going to be huge. I think they will have steady demand this year, but it certainly is having an impact on how people view the raw cashew nut market. So let's try and summarize this. August, December, what can we expect? What should we be looking for? What are the big questions? So in terms of demand, the big question really is the impact of higher prices on demand in India and in China. Two markets where consumers, distributors, roasters, packers, confectionery companies don't tend to buy forward. So they are buying as they go, a month, 2 months perhaps. How will higher prices impact that? And we have not seen that just yet. Secondly, and now we're looking at different markets. Now we're thinking of markets that buy forward. So we're thinking of markets like Europe, like North America. What will buyers do? Will they forward contract? What's going to be their attitude as they've seen so many defaults, delays, as they're trying to deal with that, as they're trying to deal with the disruption that causes at a time when indicators are that demand is quite strong. US imports are strong, European imports are strong. So we have disrupted supply chain, strong demand, higher prices, and we have the prospect of improved production in 2025. If we were to get a normal to good crop in West Africa and in India, we'd be back to the situation of 2022, 2023, where we're looking at surplus availability. How will buyers view that? Now, forward contracting is very important, not only from the buyer's point of view, but often from the processor's point of view, because forward contracting enables processors to access finance. So they might need forward contracts to access finance, but they might have buyers that don't want a forward contract. How does that work? And that's about confidence. And that is where these defaults and shipment delays will have a huge impact on the market this year. But what about RCN demand? How will it impact RCN demand? And if we look at RCN demand, and that's what we're going to do in a moment, we need to look at inventories in Vietnam and in India. How are exports going? How much product is needed to get through the rest of the year? And finally, it's been a dynamic year for cashew policy from governments, for changes, for developments, not all of them positive, but they're there and we have to keep an eye on them. In India, it looks like there's a bit more support for the rationalization, the improvement, the development of processing, which means mechanization. In East Africa, we've seen changes in Tanzania and Mozambique in the way that the cashew crop will be marketed. How will that work? Will it work for processors in Tanzania this year? And in West Africa, we have to consider how much has the confidence of investors and buyers been damaged by this 2024 season and the difficulties, the delays, the policy changes. Quite difficult to understand a lot of those moves. If you're an investor, that just might make you feel a little bit differently. If you're a processor, you might be a little bit more reluctant to commit to increase your processing volume next year. And don't forget, there are elections next year, and elections tend to add to the volatility of policy and tend to have an impact on the market. So it is going to be quite an interesting period. A lot of questions. Most of those questions will be answered between now and the end of October. And we're going to get a great chance to talk about a lot of those at the conference in Cotonou. Hope I'll see you there. That's August to December. Those are some of the issues, some of the discussions. Let's quickly update on production. We should only be talking about the Southern Hemisphere at the end of August, but we're not. We're still talking about West Africa. We're still talking about some of the issues there. Let's have a look at one or two things. Côte d'Ivoire. So we started with an official estimate of about 900,000 tons versus last year, 1.25, probably more than that, million tons. Right now, we can justify an estimate of around about 1.125 million tons. That's significantly up. And when we look at the way things are going, so people are telling us about 600,000 tons has been exported. They're telling us that processors have bought 325,000 tons. That's 925,000 tons just there. We know that there has been significant cross-border trade. Some people want to call it informal export, so let's go with that. I'm thinking maybe 75,000 tons. We know a lot moved. We have to pick a number. It's difficult to pick that number. We'll only know when we get through the crop. And of course, we know that there are plenty of stocks left in the country still to go, or in the process of going, or just shipped, being loaded, or afloat. So it does look now as if this crop is much bigger than was anticipated in the early part of the season. In Nigeria, had a look at some of the shipments. So there's about 205,000 tons arrived in the two major destinations, 205,000 tons of RCN. We think processors will work with about 60,000 tons. Some of that will go as Burma kernels, or already has, but that's around about the processing volume. So we're thinking about a crop now around about 310,000 tons, plus quite a lot of material that came in from Benin due to the export ban there. So crops are getting bigger in their forecasts. So this situation is probably nowhere near as bad in volume terms as was thought maybe back in April, early May. And finally, Guinea-Bissau, where certainly the crop looks like it's lower than the previous year, maybe about 10% lower. Again, we won't know for sure till we get right to the end of the season. But shipments are only moving quite slowly. There are problems with freight. Bissau port is always difficult. This year, all of the complexities of the current freight market have just made that more and more difficult. So exporters there are struggling through the problems. The product is moving. Most of it through Bissau port this year. You'll see this year far less coming through Dakar and Senegal, as the border was managed differently this year and product tended to move to Bissau. And in that way, we'll have a look at some figures on imports to Vietnam later, and we can see that reflected in some of the numbers. So Northern Hemisphere, a little bit of news in West Africa. Everywhere else, we pretty much know where we stand. Southern Hemisphere, well, we're just beginning the Southern Hemisphere season, and I'm going to have a look at 3 of the 4 main countries. We'll come to Mozambique next time because the Mozambique crop is a little bit later. In this period, August to December, about 14% of the world's crop is harvested. And that's spread widely. Indonesia, Tanzania, Mozambique, and Brazil. You can see the numbers on the screen. So let's have a look at the countries individually. Let's start with Indonesia. Indonesian season starts back in July and it goes through to October. People tell me a very good crop is expected in Indonesia, and you can see that the trend in recent years has been upwards. About 2.25% growth over the 10-year period. But there is some volatility in there. There's maybe even a little bit of an on-off year pattern in there. And when we look at where cashews are primarily produced in Indonesia, that might give us a little bit more of a clue. They're produced in Sulawesi, particularly southeast Sulawesi, and in the islands from Flores all the way across to Lombok. These are the main production areas. There is about, according to the Statistical Service of Indonesia, about 450,000 hectares planted to cashews in the country. They're mostly small farms, so it is difficult to judge that. Average yield is very low. Now that may be because some of these trees are new, but I think average yield is very low, but there's a wide range. So you don't get the same range of yields elsewhere. So it goes from a low of about 200 kilos per hectare up to a high of 569 kilos per hectare, average 281. High outturn RCN, large kernels, mostly grown in these 3 regions. So down in the islands, southeast Sulawesi, the Eastern Islands, the major area nowadays, 171,000 hectares, and in the Western Islands a lot less, about 45,000 hectares, mostly due to less land. We can see that the area planted has been falling. So the area planted has been falling by about 2% per annum, but we've already noted that the production has been growing by about 2.25% per annum. So this is an indicator of positive production trends. If we look at the RCN exports, we can see that RCN exports have declined. So you've got exports to Vietnam, orange, India blue, and the total exports in green. Again, these are figures from the Indonesian Statistical Service. In fact, the percentage of the crop that's exported as raw cashew nuts is down from 50% to about 20% of the crop. And that's an indicator. Of course, Indonesia is a huge country. Snacking, light meals, absolutely huge trend in the country. It's not really any surprise that consumption of cashew nuts would rise there. We see most of the cashews from Indonesia tending to go to Vietnam. And that's because if we look at this, there is a big advantage in terms of freight. There's a big advantage in terms of the journey time. So any exporter gets their money turned around much more quickly by going to Vietnam than by sending the shipment to India. And that's reflected in the trade figures, as you can see. So Indian exports have gradually declined as a percentage, and overall exports have gradually declined. So there must be some processing. Let's have a look. Well, there are, in fact, only a few large factories in Indonesia. Comextra Majora is one that comes to mind. Village processing is really important, and that's done either on full village processing in small units, but also in outsourcing of shelling, for example, and outsourcing of peeling too, I think. Exports of kernels quite low, about 2,900 tons. Let's call that something like 10,000 tons of RCN out of a crop in the region of 160,000 tons. Most of those go to the US, but Europe and Malaysia, interesting, both have shares. Again, exports of kernels have fallen, indicating that domestic consumption is rising. These are official figures on production. There are some figures knocking around that would estimate production much lower, but if you look at the hectares, if you look at the trends, I'm sure these figures aren't perfect, but they're not far off. And that's why I'm using them rather than some of the lower figures that are thrown around. There is raw cashew nut on offer from Indonesia, wide range of prices. I have heard anything from 18.20 custom freight, Vietnam up as high as 19.25 custom freight as offered prices. Quality 52, 53 pounds. These nuts are big. These nuts are high yield, and that explains the high price. They look quite competitive compared to nuts from other origins of similar quality, if you can find nuts from other origins of similar quality. Let's go on and have a quick look at Brazil. So Brazil, unfortunately, over the years in Brazil, we've seen a major drop in cashew production. A lot of trees were taken out during the prolonged drought. But for 2024, more optimistic news. Crop forecast is 146. This again is an official crop forecast. I would have to say that this time last year they were optimistic too, and they dropped their numbers down in the course of the season. But let's go with the official numbers for now, 146,000 tons. That would make it the best crop since 2018. But don't get too excited. It's good news for Brazil, but it means very little in the international market. An extra 30,000 tons of RCN, well, that doesn't mean a lot, does it really? Looking at Brazilian exports of cashew kernels, well, I think the only thing we can really say is that it has moved in line with production. And you will see when domestic demand might be a little bit weak, exports increase and vice versa. Processing in Brazil is always worth looking at. Brazil was leading in processing way back in the 1970s, early 1980s, with, I think it went up as high as 14, maybe 15 large factories at one stage. Today, it's 3 or 4 operational factories. High technology, using their own technology as well as imported technology. The approach is corporate. Processors tend to be very reliable on contracts. Quality tends to be high. Food safety standards are also high. A good example of how to build a mechanized industry, unfortunately, supplies dwindled from a high of about 450,000 tons back around 2005 to today's estimate 146,000 tons. But still, Brazilian cashews trade at premium prices. There are also, by the way, and also worth looking at, especially if you're looking at domestic consumption in West African countries, there are also a number of smaller factories, mini factories as they call them, and they have some interesting solutions for small-scale processing. So Brazil, not a great deal of change, but more optimistic outlook for the crop. One thing we should note in the longer run, Brazil is a growing market for tree nuts. Brazil imports almonds, hazelnuts, and other nuts. In 2023, Brazil imported about 20,000 tons of tree nuts. That's 41% above the 2019 figure. This is a big trend. Brazil, of course, is a big country, huge population. We may well see that Brazil starts to consume more and more of the cashews that it grows. And that would mean something in the international market for buyers who've become used to using Brazilian cashew kernels, especially as ingredients, and especially the fact that Brazilian processors are highly reliable. The third country I want to have a look at today is Tanzania. Tanzania's harvest has started. It's basically September through to December. A very good crop is forecast. Now, I put down a figure here, which would be a record crop. On what I understand, I've put down about 325,000 tons, but I've seen numbers way higher than that. I think we can say right now the crop looks really good. It will be an increase year, I think, but I'm not sure that some of the numbers bandied about in the market I'm not sure that they're really intended to do anything other than impact the price of raw cashew nuts in Tanzania. And that's wrong, and that's not fair to farmers or to the processors in the country. What I would draw your attention to is looking at the map. You've got traditional growing areas in the southeast of the country. You've got Mtwara, Lindi, Tandahimba, these areas. But there is also a tendency now to plant trees further north, more centrally, Dodoma, for example. In these regions, we could be seeing the development of a crop that comes in more like a Northern Hemisphere crop, a little by the few existing trees up in the Tanga region. If that happens, you could see a situation where Tanzania in the future has a crop September to December, and then again, February or March through to May, which changes the dynamic for processing in the future. But for now, those trees are young, and we're not seeing enough of them planted to make a huge difference. From September 1st, processors, following changes to the system made in the last couple of years, can buy directly from local co-ops. That is a revolution for processing in Tanzania. It's a positive thing, and that has been seen to reflect on investment in processing. The auction, we don't know for certain, but I'm guessing the auction will kick off mid-October. So between early September and mid-October, processors have a chance to work with the co-ops, do business, buy their processing stock for the year. Tanzania is developing, the cashew sector is developing. The key things that I'm noticing are access, as I mentioned, to cooperatives for processors. There's increased processing activity. I've included some of the logos of companies there. There are others, and this is coming along quite nicely at the moment. The Cashew Board of Tanzania, has commissioned and is developing a cashew industrial park in Mtwara, I believe, in the port area, and they are looking at supporting more use of technology in cashew processing. There's also talk, but it's not clear how this will work, but there's talk that the government or the board will build some trade finance mechanisms that will use the funding or use some of the taxation to fund the cashew industry. That too could be an interesting catalyst for processing in the country. I'm going to ask Alfred Francis of the Cashew Board of Tanzania to join us at one of the coming sessions, and we'll have a little bit of a discussion on that if he's available, and we could do that maybe when the auction starts to open. So Tanzania, positive outlook in more ways than just the crop. It looks as if the country which led the cashew industry way back in the 1970s is again revitalizing its cashew business, and let's hope that that continues. So if we look at production, the impact of these various factors overall, we have upped our estimate a little bit of production, and the gap between the high and the low estimate has come down a little bit. So at the high estimate, we're just slightly below last year's crop. Last year's crop was a record crop. On our high estimate, that's about 5% below last year's. At the lower end of our estimate, we'd be looking at something similar to the 2022 crop, about 9% below last year. So that margin has come in from -4 to -14 at one stage, and it's now come in. So I think worldwide, we're probably looking at somewhere between these two figures for production this year. The difference is mainly due to differences in estimates of the Indian crop and a lot of small differences in West African countries. So differences over a large number of countries add up, and that's where we get the difference between the high and low. The Southern Hemisphere is based on our estimates as of the 15th of August. We'll be updating that as we go, and hopefully we'll have some of the key stakeholders joining us in the coming months to discuss how that's progressing. I think we probably should mention one thing. This RCN estimate is tons, but the impact of the lower crop, particularly for processors in West Africa, but also elsewhere, the impact of that lower crop is multiplied, is increased by the lower outturn and the lower quality of the cashew kernels harvested in West Africa this year. So it can be, I think at one point we calculated that in one or two countries where quality was lower, I think we spoke about Cote d'Ivoire, and that the lower quality could have an impact of about a further 4%. But again, the way cashews works, as you know, it's not easy to figure these things out as we go. We'll keep researching, we'll keep working on it, and we'll keep you informed on that. So key points on production so far. Yes, production is lower in West Africa, but it's not unmanageably lower. It's not the way that it was spoken about way back in February and March. Lower quality has been a big feature throughout this year, and that's increased the impact of the lower tonnage. Some of those early forecasts, as I've mentioned, were pessimistic. I think this is a really important feature for the future of this business. Were these just simply misinformed forecasts, or was there an effort to inflate raw cashew nut prices? My guess is they were simply misinformed, and I'd love to see systems put in place to get better estimates of crops. Business, investment doesn't like volatility. It likes predictability. It likes steady trends. So we need to put in place systems where we can make sure that we're giving, from official sources, crop forecasts that make sense and that don't exaggerate one way or the other. Southern Hemisphere, all forecasts positive, hopefully correct. One note of caution: at the end of August last year, there were positive forecasts in Tanzania, in Brazil, in Mozambique, and they didn't quite work out as good as we thought they might. So official sources at this time of year tend to be very positive. Let's hope they're right. Let's hope that people on the ground who are also telling me that the crops look good, let's hope they're right, and we see this supply coming to market. Now, just to underline, all those crops, all those 4 or 5 crops added up, it's still only 14% of supply. So you don't get, in this quieter period, you don't get a major supply coming to market that can change the balance. Speaking of balances, let's have a look at the situation in Vietnam and in India. We've been having a look throughout this year at I think almost at every ACA GME event, we've looked at trade in Vietnam and India and the balance of stock, and we've been tracking how that looks. Up to now, we've generally found that the news from Vietnam was a little bit more pessimistic, perhaps in anticipation of what was to come. But generally, people telling us they were running out of stock didn't add up in the numbers. I think that's changed a bit. So let's have a look at some of the numbers. First of all, we can see that 15th of August, so January, 15 August, import figures for Vietnam. I use Vietnam's customs service figures. I cross-check them with Vinacast. They never match, but I think we're not far off the right number, but I use the customs figures just for your information. Basically, we're on par. Now, running throughout the season so far, it's been ahead. Always imports were ahead of last year. Now, as we get into the 15th of August, The 8.4% up is down to 0.32%, basically par. And that is primarily on lower imports from Côte d'Ivoire, 100,000 tonnes less imported in 2024, January to August 15th, than in the same period last year. That's maybe a clue that we're getting a tightness. Let's have a look at the monthly imports. So when we look at monthly imports, red is 2024, blue is 2023. The July figures well below July 2023. First half August, again, even more so below. And of course, if we look at this and we compare let's just add in the moving average trend over the years. So you can see 2023 and 2022, the peak months for import, June, July. So you get early peaks coming in from Cambodia, and then as West African material arrives, June, July. But that doesn't look to be the case this year. We would imagine, we would hope, that by the time we get to September, we'll see more product coming in. In fact, if we look at this, there's about 171,000 tonnes deficit compared to last year. This is significant. It's significant because there's huge exports and not very much time left in the year. So how has this come about? So we'll take a look at some of the numbers from individual countries. And you can see, of course, Cambodia, again, these are January to July. I don't have country by country figures to the 15th of August. We'll have those in a couple of weeks. January to July, Cambodia, very strong, additional 216,000 tonnes. But if we look elsewhere, the picture is a little bit different. So we're looking at Tanzania, Côte d'Ivoire, around about 100,000 tonnes, as I said, a little bit more from Ghana, and a little bit more from Nigeria too. So if we take these major African origins, they're about, the net is down by about 100,000 tonnes, 104, 105,000 tonnes, a bit more from Ghana, a bit less from Tanzania, a lot less from Côte d'Ivoire. But this is balanced, or was balanced for a long time, by the additional imports from Cambodia. But that Cambodian crop is finished. It has been finished for some time. And in the second half of the year, you do get imports from Cambodia, but they tend to be much lower. We would expect maybe another 20,000 tonnes over the course of the second half of the year. We think there is a little bit left in Cambodia. So what's happening now is that the slower shipments from Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea-Bissau, other countries are start balance. So how does it look? Is there enough material to get us through to the situation when, let's say, the next wave of Ivorian shipments arrives, those goods that were promised a long time ago but delayed by the export ban? So if we look at, again, I haven't changed the opening stock, looking at about 296,000 tonnes by our calculation. That includes work in progress. Estimated the crop at 315,000 tonnes, low, certainly. Could be a little bit lower, could be a little bit higher, nothing that makes a big difference. We know what the imports are. One number that is surprising is, and this is a Vinacast number, the import of Burma kernels. So this is the import of Burma kernels converted to RCN. I use 22% as a conversion factor. That's a big number. That's a really big number. And I'm a bit puzzled by it because I'm trying to work out the logic of that from the African perspective and just exactly how much has been processed in Africa but exported as Burma kernels. Export and domestic, so we know what exports are. We have the figures. This export figure includes the processed kernels, so this is the Venacast figure, and that would give us a balance. So opening stock plus the crop, plus the imports, plus the Burma kernels, less the exports and some domestic consumption. That's the number you get, 560,000 tons. And that, based on what's happening this year, is only about 1.8 months from mid-August. That balance is down. It's significantly down. It's down by 20% since the 15th of July. So, as I said, these delays in shipments are now starting to bite. In fact, this long ban from Côte d'Ivoire of export of RCN looks more and more difficult, even disastrous for the market than we previously expected. The calculated inventories are probably too low for the time of year. Certainly too low for the time of year if exports continue at the rate that we've seen for the first 7.5 months of the year. What that means we'll come to in a few minutes. Burma kernels imports basically have kept the balance positive. But it is, as I mentioned, quite difficult to understand the figure, at least for me to understand it. And I'm going to have to take a look into that, and we'll talk about that again. What could this mean? Well, first thing is, I don't think it means that Vietnam runs out of RCN. Let's forget that idea. That's not going to happen. There are shipments coming. There is product around. But I do think it is going to be more difficult to get low price contracts shipped. I think that's going to get more and more difficult. I don't think that kernels prices will jump up because I think buyers simply wouldn't follow it. That's not to say you might see a spike here and there, but I think that buyers would react negatively to much higher kernels prices. So I don't think that will happen. But I think it could have a big impact on forward contracting, particularly if there was a rise in prices. So if we take today's 320s, let's say 330, mid-price between the top and the lower processors, and there are a few lower offers around today. If that got to 350, I'm not sure that buyers would chase it. We'll come back to that too. So it looks quite tight now, and we are now beginning to see this bite. Now the ban was lifted. If those shipments started to get out immediately, if all of the shipments that were slow from Guinea-Bissau, that were slow from Nigeria, and are somewhere between the two countries, if all those catch up, then I don't think there's a problem. And they will catch up. The question is when, how long, and whether or not it gets so tight. And there is another question too. And the other question is who holds this inventory? If it's not in the hands of processors, this is just a calculated figure. This is not a figure that says A has this, B has this, C has this. This is a figure that's... And if we look at the other figure where we see volatility is Benin and Togo. Benin's exports since 2022 have collapsed because RCN export is banned. Togo's imports have exploded. And that's not production. So that is an impact of trade. And it's a real question mark over cashew policy, when effectively a ban simply means that the product moves to a neighboring country and gets shipped from there. And that's what we're seeing. So looking in India, let's have a look at the Indian situation. Again, I think the stock in India was quite high going into this year. About 450,000 tons, that includes kernels. I've put in quite a conservative estimate of the crop. Crop could easily be bigger than this, but I'm using a conservative estimate based on some of the reports we've seen. If it gets better, all the better. Imports of RCN are known to date. This is again July numbers. Consumption is essentially based on taking the annual consumption, correcting that a little bit for some seasonality, mainly related to the big festival season around Diwali. And that would give us a calculated balance of about 650,000 tons. That does not mean 650,000 tonnes of RCN in warehouses. That means 650,000 tonnes in the country that hasn't been delivered by this calculation. Could be sold, could be in warehouses, but it's most likely belongs to processors. That's about 4¼ months supply, more than adequate for the time of year. So to me, India looks a bit different to Vietnam, whereas Vietnam is getting tighter and tighter for supply. India looks relatively comfortable at the moment. So the situation remains fluid, of course, because of the time of year, but I think Indian imports could fall below the 2023 figure. 2023 was just under 1.2 million tonnes. That could be just over a million. It could even be just below a million, depending on how things go over the coming months. Consumption in India, I was part of the All India Cashew Association conference recently, a really good event, and there were some very interesting discussions on cashew consumption in India. India is the largest consumer in the world, as you know. Growth appears to be steady, but much slower than in the last decade. So going back 10, 15 years, we'd become used to growth in India of 6-7% per annum. That looks much more like maybe 3.5%, 4% now. Still a big number, but not as big as it was. The market is changing in India too. The structure of the market is changing. It's becoming more corporate. Bigger businesses are getting involved. So-called modern retail is having an impact, including online sales. There is support coming in only recently for mechanization. So India's always had some small-scale grants and supports for processors to develop their process. But I think at last there are some signs that there will be good support for the development of mechanized processing in India. And in the long run, that'll be good for business. In the short run, it probably will cost some jobs. I think that once this process is complete, once we get some rationalization in processing and we get the structure of the market working its way out as it is now, I think we'll see rapid growth again in India. I wouldn't be at all surprised if 3-4 years from now we saw the Indian market growing at 7 to 10% per annum for a number of years. And that would have a huge impact on world supply and demand, of course. So key points on India and Vietnam balances and calculations. The Vietnamese stock situation on raw cashew nuts has tightened. Shipments are needed. I think some processors, particularly smaller ones, are more likely to reduce their processing volumes. And the difficulty with some of the lower priced contracts is more than likely to continue for the rest of the year. Indian situation looks a little bit less stressed in terms of stock, and I think by the end of the year, imports probably will be below last year's figure. By how much is difficult to say. My guess is that it could be just either side of 1 million tonnes in terms of imports. Looking at the Southern Hemisphere crops, I think that the East African crops, including Tanzania, probably arrived too late to make a huge difference this year. People will buy Tanzanian RCN for the gap, to bridge the gap between the end of this year and the beginning of the new crop in Vietnam, Cambodia, and India. I think there could be quite strong buying interest for Indonesian RCN. Right now, it's quite well priced given the quality. And I think that market will be supported. And I hear again this morning after my recent forecast, I hear again that people are talking about a very good crop in Indonesia. Time will tell. So an interesting situation, very different in Vietnam than in India, as it generally is. Room for a certain amount of volatility, but I'm not sure that the market will sustain rises in kernel prices. But we do need to keep a close eye on this situation because there are a number of factors out there that can change in the coming months. One of those, of course, is demand. That is really an amazing figure. So the increase in exports is the equivalent of about 385,000 additional tons of RCN. Now we've seen that imports are not covering that. We've seen that the crop in Vietnam is not covering that. It is partly covered by the relatively high carry-in stock, but this is why the situation is tightening. Imports are not bad in terms of the comparison with last year. They're well on track, but exports are much higher. And if we look at exports monthly over the year, it's interesting to note that we had a very strong start to the year. So this may well be an indicator of, well, it's timing, it's calendar, it's when the Tet Festival was as well. But it also an indicator that there may have been some shipments made early in anticipation of disruption to shipping. After that, fairly steady, a poor June, but pretty strong throughout. If we took out this January, that we just exclude this Jan-Feb and looked at what's happened since, the average increase is about 15%. So that does indicate that, yes, early shipments probably have played a part. And why are early shipments interesting? Well, they're interesting because they tell us how much inventory buyers at destination may already have in hand, particularly in the Western markets where they buy forward. It might also tell us, of course, that Chinese demand at that time of year was very strong this year. And I think that's also true. So early shipments have played a part in this, but I think that really what we're seeing is very strong underlying demand looking at these numbers. And if we look a little bit further and if we delve in and look at the different destinations. So what I do is I take a group of countries in East Asia, West Asia, which is essentially Middle East, a little bit of North Africa, the top 9 in Europe, North America, Canada and the US, and China, and we look at the trend 2022, this is January to July, 2023 in orange, and this year in blue. And what are we seeing? Well, we're seeing just about everywhere is way up. East Asia up 6%, West Asia, mainly the Middle East, up 22%, very strong growth. Europe, 18%, shipments are up 18%. That's not reflected in import figures so far. It'll be interesting to see how that pans out as the season goes on. The US, I think, responding to lower prices, up 26%. And then the one that really is most remarkable, shipments to China are up by 56%. Very, very strong demand. So we're seeing shipments. If it's in blue, it means the trend has accelerated during the year. If it's in black, it means this trend has been steady, but China is actually slowing down a little bit. The extent of the growth is slowing down, but these other markets have accelerated. So we are seeing very healthy demand situation. So let's have a look at the monthly situation. So again, I took 3 markets that we can use as good indicators. China because of its growth, the US because of its size, and I've taken the Netherlands as a representative of the European Union. The Netherlands is the key market for imports of cashew kernels into Europe. So starting with China, what we can see is a trend. So the dotted line is the 2023 trend, and that steady line is the 2024 trend. So what we're seeing is a little bit of a slowdown, because the closer these lines get together, that means that the increase is slowing down. So we had a very strong increase in April, May, and it's been a little bit less in June and July. If we look at the United States, there's 2024. Here's 2023. Apart from something of an interruption in June, which may have been simply that shipments weren't going out, it looks fairly steady throughout the year, that the gap between 24 and 23 is steady since February. and that we are looking at a sustainable increase in US demand, and that this is more than just additional shipments taken early to manage the risk. Looking at the Netherlands, again, 2024 and 2023, a lower level of increase, but these figures, the two trends have basically tracked each other all year. Again, this is indicating that we've got a situation where there is a fundamental improvement in demand and that it's possibly impacted by some early shipments, but I think there's much more than that. I think that there is much more of a strong demand trend than there is any technical explanation for the additional shipments. What conclusion can we draw from that is that this is likely to continue for the rest of the year. Let's have a little bit closer look at some of these things. China, slower shipments in July. The question is, and this is a big question coming now in markets, we've already asked it, I'll say it again, how will the higher prices impact on demand, especially in markets that don't buy forward? So in China, the question is the July slowdown in growth? It's still a very good number, don't get me wrong, but is that slowdown in growth due to higher prices, or is it simply that some seasonal demand for the autumn festivals is faded and we'll see that spike up again October, November, December? That's a significant question. Looking at the US, growth appears to be accelerating. It certainly is the case that high prices have not yet impacted at the import or at the consumer level. The Netherlands, our example for the EU, again, it looks like consumption has returned to a fairly resilient pattern, that we're seeing steady growth, and perhaps that there's some catching up going on for what happened in the course of 2022 and 2023, particularly 2022, when we saw, with pressure on the economies, pressure on consumers, rising prices for all kinds of things, we saw a little bit of a slowdown in growth, and it looks as if that's returning now. India, the most important market, we've got to look at it. There's no numbers for consumption in India. That's the nature of the market right now. Still a growth forecast about 3.5%. We're looking at, from what I understand, differences between segments. So the top end and the bottom end is growing and the middle is just moving along steadily. So far, anecdotal reports tell us that demand is quite good, that the initial festival demand, there's a number of festivals in the second half of the year in India, that the initial demand is good. There is still a question mark, will the higher prices impact later? And there's a number of things to take into account. Will people simply not pay those prices, or will they shift to other products like almonds, for example? So almonds, and I think also pistachio, have been making some inroads in recent years. So big questions around the impact of high prices, but not only high prices, also the resolution of defaults and delays in shipment of cashew kernels. It is doing damage. There's no question about that. The question is not whether it's doing damage or not. The question is how much damage is being done to demand, and particularly to buyers' confidence. And that's going to impact how they behave in terms of their forward contracting. And as I said, forward contracting is going to impact on the available finance in the market. And that will actually have results next January, February, March, when processors look to buy new crop. So let's have a look at some of these prices that we've been talking about. I won't go into too much detail on prices, but we'll have a quick look. Prices have come down a little bit since the last time we talked. It's been relatively quiet. Prices drifted a little bit. I noticed one or two lower priced offers in the market from Vietnam, not many, but a few. A little feeling that one or two people would like to sell something that they have, but no, I don't think there's any sign of major volatility on kernels for the time being, at least. The general level of prices, and we're talking about prices above $3, above $3.25. Generally speaking, these prices are sustainable in the longer run. I mean, in terms of whether the demand for cashew kernels can cope with prices based on 320s at $3.25 FOB, I don't think there's any question. I think it absolutely can. But shorter term, we've mentioned the difficulties with shipments, and that can have an impact. So not a great deal to talk about on cashew kernels prices. We'll have a quick look at raw cashew nuts. Couple of factors here. We can see prices have stayed quite strong. Obviously, as the year goes on, the availability is reduced because the product has been bought or has been used. The premiums for higher quality material have widened, and I think that's understandable. So some countries, the quality has been declining. Those that have higher quality can ask higher prices. I'm thinking perhaps Guinea-Bissau, Indonesia, Tanzania, eventually a little bit later. Processors, they can work on these current RCN levels based on current kernels levels, but it's a real struggle based on older contracts. Now, the combination of quite high RCN prices and relatively stable kernels prices leads me to think that there's very little upside on RCN prices. If I owned raw cashew nuts today of good quality, I think I'd sell them. I don't really see a big upside. What I do see maybe as the year goes on is a little bit of reduced processing, further contract delays, and an impact on demand. So unless kernels prices do something that we don't expect, i.e. shoot up, I don't think RCN is going to move either. But higher quality may well achieve higher prices relative to low quality material. So let's try and have a look at some of the key points. So what we're saying on production is that production is higher than forecast originally, but lower than 2023. Not much more than that. Demand and processing, we think the cashew kernels prices are sustainable at the current levels in the long run. We see the RCN situation tightening in Vietnam, but manageable in India. Demand for kernels, demand for RCN is relatively strong. Demand for kernels is relatively strong, but I think it's likely to cool based on the higher prices that we've seen, and simply based on the calendar. I mean, we are approaching the time when all of these festivals, the demand for those will be fulfilled, and buyers of kernels, and indeed of RCN, will have the choice to do nothing as well as to buy. As I said, I think kernels prices are sustainable, but I also think that buyers may well limit their buying. I'm talking about forward contracting mainly here due to defaults and perhaps the prospect of a much better crop in 2025. Certainly if the Southern Hemisphere forecasts are any indicator, we should expect good crops again in 2025. Of course, that's a long way away in one sense. But if you think about flowering, the Northern Hemisphere crops, well, 3.5 months away, and we'll be seeing indications of the next crop in the Northern Hemisphere. So the impact of these factors, I think demand will continue to grow, but I think it will grow more slowly. I think this year will impact processing. There will be faster rationalization. And I mean that in all countries, in West Africa, in India, and in Vietnam. So we will probably see more exports of secondary processed products from Vietnam. We will probably see some factories in West Africa disappear and others thrive. We will probably see faster move to mechanization in India. There is a possibility of a price fall. Now, I don't think below $3, but there is possibility of price fall in early 2025. There may be fewer forward contracts. A good crop might see a return to a surplus next year. And I think there's almost certainly going to be a loss of a certain amount of confidence at every levels, given some of the behaviors in the market in 2024, and that will have an impact. One thing I haven't mentioned there, which I'll add, is that there may be, because of less forward contracting, there may be less money around, and if there's less money around, that too can have an influence on prices. So there we stand. Those are the key points as we see them today. If you've got any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them. Meantime, I'll pass you back to Ernest.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jim Fitzpatrick. Always very insightful information being given. Today we have only 3 questions and then a couple of information requests. Someone is asking for sharing of the export data for 2022 to 2024. You can contact ACA directly. And but then by the end of the year, we have the reprogrammed version of the Cashew database, known as the Cashew Barometer, going to come up with support from the EU, so that the industry will have a very strong data tool to be able to assess all the data that we share with you through this webinar. Again, there is also the question of given the drop in RCN imports from IVC by Vietnam, which is estimated around 100,000 metric tons. It will be interesting when we restart the GME in October to share information on kernel exports from IVC in 2024. I think that will give real information as to where or who is holding the stock which has been delayed. But I'll come back to the question of who holds the top stock. The other information is more on data. We have a questioner who says CBT estimate for production is 310,000 thereabouts, but then your slide was giving something below 300,000. So I think maybe you can explain how that information was obtained in terms of data.
Well, I'll tell you how we calculate
I'll follow
that.
the 3 questions that we have now.
So, yeah, I mean, it's all very well to make an estimate early in the season, but when you look at what was exported, what was imported, what was processed, what was exported, 310,000 tons does not add up. Simple as that.
Okay. But let me say that Francis Alfred, the Director General of the CBT, will be in Cotonou, and will also be sharing information. And I think it will also be the right opportunity for him to provide more information on this. But let me move on to the first question. Given the prospects in Tanzania looks very good. This is what the person is saying. However, will their exports and prices be affected by the export delays experienced in IVC? I think you show the policy, what policies have been introduced, and how it will impact on processing. But then the question is whether the IVC situation and how indeed it will affect their impact on their exports and also on their prices.
In Tanzania?
Yes, Tanzania, yes.
Okay. Well, so on the one hand, the delay from Cote d'Ivoire in shipments will mean that some of the should have arrived or would have been expected to arrive in July and August will arrive in September and October. I'm talking mostly in Vietnam. Now, what we've noticed this year is that physical arrivals have more of an impact on the way processors think than contracting or delays or anything else. So we could see greater physical arrivals later in the season. And that could encourage buyers to stay away from Tanzania early on because they may well have enough material. Now, whether or not people buy their raw cashew nuts from Tanzania will depend on whether or not they believe that the cashew kernel's price come January, February, March will work for them, or whether or not they have forward contracts for those periods and beyond. Because don't forget, if you buy in end of October, you're not seeing that probably processing in January. So you're delivering that back out in February. So there is a time scale. So I think that the impact of the Ivorian delay, given that we've got this far, given that it's impacted the market, given that those factors are already included in the current pricing, I think that it's not going to have a particularly positive effect on Tanzania. If anything, it could delay buying, which might have a slightly negative effect on the movement of the product and the pricing in the current season. Now, we should also look at India, because what happens in demand in India will also influence buying in Tanzania.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. The next question is on the Indonesian crop, and the question is, what is the impact really of the Indonesian crop on the global demand, especially also what is the estimates for production for 2024? I think your slide was showing the figures for 2023. But again, if you take Indonesia, they are producing, they also have some large factories. You were saying that 2023, they put out about 30,000 in terms of exports of RCN. What is it going to be like? What is your estimate for 2024? And how important are they in terms of the global supply of RCN?
Well, all of these Southern Hemisphere countries have an impact in that period, October, November, December. But if we look at the total supply situation, of course, the impact is much less. But it is important in this period, October, November, December. Key things about Indonesia, taking the BPS crop estimates, only about 20% of the crop is exported as RCN. Only about 3,000 tons of kernels were exported, according to their figures, last year. What's the impact of that on the overall supply and demand situation? Not a lot, that's true, but in certain periods of time, the arrival of high quality raw cashew nuts into the market will have an impact, and it will take a little bit of pressure. We very rarely speak about Indonesia in terms of supply and demand, but because we're talking about a relatively disrupted season, it becomes important this year. And we're not talking about large volumes. If you look at the total exports, 30,000 tons, 30,000 tons, 55,000 tons, you go back to 2020. This is not going to change the world. I mean, if you think that India uses about 150,000 tons a month, Vietnam uses maybe 193,000 tons a month, this is not changing the supply and demand situation. But that's not to understate the opportunity and the importance of business in Indonesia. But it's a huge country too, let's not forget that, and the consumption in Indonesia. So I think what people often talk about is what's exported and what's processed for export, rather than looking at the whole picture. And that's why we get this big variation in the production figure. But for me, no, it's not going to have a huge influence, but it does have a certain influence in certain markets, and it's well worth keeping an eye on.
All right, okay. Again, what is, you talked about Benin, and I know the questioner wants to know what is the update on Benin and whether the country has anything to ship. I think you talked about it, you showed the graph, how it's falling, exports are falling in Benin and rising in Togo in terms of cross-border trade occurring there. But again, is this a trend that you expect to continue in the coming year? Maybe taking out from that question here.
Okay, that's a really great question, and it's a really difficult question to answer, but I'll just share my opinion on it. So I would say that the introduction of the ban on the export of raw cashew nuts is the first step in the job. Second step was to build some factories. That too has happened, is happening, and there were factories there before the current new factories. That's the second part of the job. But the third part of the job, which I'm not going to say is to close the borders to RCN, because that's too difficult. The third part of the job is to link the supply chain together so that processors, cooperatives, farmers can work together to ensure that the processors have enough material and that the farmers have an outlet and a fair price, competitive fair price for their products. And that seems to need to be worked on. In the meantime, it looks like that the cross-border trade is a kind of a safety valve. And unfortunately, that safety valve has been more attractive this year. Many processors, particularly traditional processors, but also the new processors, have not come anywhere close to buying what they wanted to buy, what they needed to buy in order to get their capacity up to profitable levels. And that's a problem. So, you can argue which way around it should have been done. You can argue whether it should have been done at all. But the reality is that there is a ban on exports of raw cashew nuts. And the only way to manage that is to develop a supply chain that links growers to processors. I think at this point, we would be very surprised if the export ban was lifted.
Yeah.
And therefore, we're talking about how is the supply chain organized? And that, for me, would be a really interesting topic of conversation at the conference in Cotonou in September.
And indeed, it will be, and there will also be a visit to the Arise GDIZ zone to see what processing facilities have been put up there and how they are functioning. To also know whether this year they got some crop to process and to see how they are coping with the situation there. But moving on from Benin to Nigeria, I have a question here from Tanvir, who wants to know whether we expect correction in RCN prices in Nigeria for 2025.
Well, I don't have my crystal ball with me this morning. Yeah, it's a good question, but it's
a situation there, yes. Yeah.
It's a tricky one. So all you get for this, Tanvir, all you get for this good question is a kind of a qualified answer. So first qualification is, let's assume that the crops are good. Northern Hemisphere crops are good next year. Let's assume the cashew kernels prices are sustained in or around the current levels. In that case, I would expect that there would be something of a correction. And by that, I mean lower farm gate prices next year. Therefore, yeah, I would see a correction in prices. However, we also have to consider the condition of the Nigerian economy and how the currency behaves, which will also have an impact on how people trade commodities. So short answer is, yes, I do expect a correction. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's a correction up. I think it's a correction down, but there's a lot of qualifications around that, as I've mentioned. Thanks for the question, though.
And thank you. And final question is on global demand estimates. I think you've given the demand estimates for the different countries, but then what is the global demand estimate, or what was indeed the global demand estimate for 2023 in RCN terms? And then what is the growth expected for 2024? So more or less the aggregate, because you gave the different countries. So what was it for 2023? And what is the expected growth number for 2024?
I am not going to answer the question about calculating RCN and kernels, simply because that just leads to debates about whether you should use a yield factor of 22% or 23 or 24, whatever it is. What I'm thinking is that we're seeing significant growth in demand this year. We are already far enough into the year to know that that is a fact for this year. It's almost in every market, and that's interesting. Mm-hmm. Now, the question is, will that be sustained for the end of the year? Now, I feel it will be sustained in the United States, North America generally. It will be sustained in Europe. It's most likely to be sustained in China. How it would work out in India, I'd be optimistic, but there's a question mark. And then the Middle Eastern market, the impact there is also a question mark, because those prices are passed on immediately. There is a factor, I think, in Western markets where a lot of the lower prices were never passed on for various reasons, including other costs like energy being so much higher. So having not passed on the prices, I think we can assume that the current rise is not due to lower consumer prices. It's due to corporations changing their view. So having changed their view, they'll be very slow to change back. So I'm optimistic on demand for the rest of the year. I would not be surprised if we get a average demand increase in the high single digits this year. That's the way it looks right now. Now, it could be that buyers will shut off shipments for the last quarter. That's happened before. It happened in 2022, but there's no indication of that yet. So it's going to be a very strong year for demand growth. And by the way, we needed a very strong year for demand growth, because if we match supply and demand currently, if we took a good to normal crop in West Africa, a good to normal crop in India, the same crop as 2024 in Cambodia, Vietnam, elsewhere, we end up with a surplus. So we do need growth in demand. This growth is based on a long period of lower prices. That's gone. Where's the next stimulus for growth going to come from? People do want to eat more cashews.
Yeah.
Are we giving them the right reasons to do that? Are we allowing them to access the supply chain? Are we alleviating their concerns about sustainable supply? Are we alleviating their concerns about the impact of the cashew industry on people, particularly people in developing countries? I'm not sure we are. And that's an issue we need to address. I will look at the calculation RCN versus supply versus demand, and I'll talk to you about it the next time we get together for the GME in October.
Thanks, Jim. And it's good you talked about the issue of sustainability. As I mentioned earlier on, in October, after we commence the GME again, we will start another webinar, and this will be ACA and Sustainable Nuts Initiative webinar focusing on sustainability. It's becoming a big issue for our end markets, and we need to be sure that we are educating all the processing and producing countries of cashew on the issues that are coming up, especially issues in other crops, which eventually may come up in cashew as well. So this is what is coming your way. But Jim, I was almost going to ask you, what should we expect between now and October? But that is too much. That would be rocket science. So what are we expecting in the next 2 weeks, please?
So I think what we need to look at in the next 2 weeks is continue to keep a close eye on the situation in Vietnam, the arrivals of RCN in the second half of August and shipments that will arrive in September. That's becoming a critical factor. Secondly, we need to bear in mind who holds whatever inventory is available. Is it in the hands of processors? Is it in the hands of traders? Key factor. We want to keep a close eye, not only over the next 2 weeks, but over the next 2 months, over how demand in India responds to higher prices. As I said, looks okay for now. Let's hope it stays that way. I really would like to see, and this maybe is over a longer term, how are processors going to react to this rather turbulent year for them? Will there be a rationalization? What changes will be made? How will all this contract situation be finally resolved? And finally, of course, and we'll be talking about this in Cotonou, and we'll be talking about it in October, how are those important East African crops looking? And don't forget, I'm going to talk about Mozambique the next time. We haven't got to Mozambique yet. We're going to talk about that again in October. So plenty, it's a quieter time of year, but plenty going on, plenty of questions. And I think what we will see is that what's happened so far this year will cast a long shadow, not only into the 2025 season, but beyond that too.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you so much. Always on point, and always sharing information with the industry and helping us to analyze better. And please, Jim Fitzpatrick is going to be at the conference, and we are hoping that we will have a special session with him. It's still on, and we hope that we will learn a lot from him during the conference. Francis Alspread, as I said, will also be there, and other industry experts to address all your key questions. So thank you all for joining us, and see you again in October. But before October, see you at the conference in Cotonou, Benin, from the 17th to the 20th of September. And all the best with everything that you're doing, and see you again. Bye-bye. Hey, Jim, take care and see you soon.
Mind yourself, Ernest. See you in Cotonou.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.
Sure, thank you. Bye, and take care too. Bye.